September 15th, 1944. The island of Peleliu, a patch of coral and jungle barely 6 miles long, was about to witness one of the most brutal confrontations of the Pacific War. In a bunker carved deep into the coral ridgeline, Japanese Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto adjusted his field glasses. His men had spent months turning this hill, later known as Bloody Nose Ridge, into a fortress. Every cave was reinforced, every firing arc measured, every field of fire rehearsed. They had studied the battles of Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. They knew the pattern of American assaults: bombardment, landing, then infantry advance. They believed they were ready for all of it. At 5:47 hours, Yamamoto was confident. The American Navy had shelled the island for days, but his bunkers held firm. He had seen this before. The storm of steel that failed to destroy the Imperial Army's hidden defenses. But at 6:12 hours, everything changed. A strange sound rolled across the battlefield. It wasn't artillery, it wasn't the chatter of Japanese Type 92s. It was a continuous pounding thunder that chewed through the air and tore apart coral and concrete alike. Within minutes, the ridgeline's carefully built defenses were collapsing. Positions that had been calculated to withstand naval bombardment were being shredded open. Yamamoto's surviving men would later write a phrase in their journals, one that American intelligence would find repeated across dozens of captured documents. Akuma no buki, as the devil's weapon. They had just encountered the M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon so devastating it would rewrite Japanese defensive doctrine across the Pacific. The M2 Browning wasn't new in 1944. It had been born at the end of the First World War, designed by the legendary American gunsmith John Moses Browning, who sought to create a heavy machine gun powerful enough to destroy aircraft and light armor. The US Army called it simply the Air. 50 caliber, but to the men who fired it, it was more than a gun. It was raw mechanical power. Each round of 450 BMG ammunition was over 5 inches long and weighed more than 4 times as much as a standard rifle bullet. When fired, it left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second, carrying more than 13,000 foot-pounds of energy, enough to punch through steel armor, concrete, or coral rock. The M2 could fire between 450 and 550 rounds per minute from belts of linked ammunition. Its heavy barrel absorbed heat, allowing sustained bursts that lighter weapons could never manage. Where ordinary machine guns fired in short, cautious bursts, the Browning could roar for 20 seconds straight, long enough to turn a bunker into rubble. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, it had been adapted for ground use throughout the 1930s. By 1944, every Marine division in the Pacific carried dozens of them, mounted on tripods, half-tracks, and tanks. The Americans had found their ultimate bunker killer. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command had spent the year before Peleliu analyzing every US landing since Guadalcanal. They refined their manuals, reinforced their fortifications, and optimized every inch of the island's defenses. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the man tasked with defending Peleliu, oversaw more than 500 fortifications across the island. His engineers built them into coral ridges with walls of concrete up to 5 feet thick. Each position was designed to survive shell fire and interlock with neighboring bunkers to form a web of overlapping fields of fire. Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns, chambered in 7.7.7 American infantry from hundreds of meters away. Their entire strategy relied on the assumption that the Americans' heaviest portable gun was still the 30 caliber Browning, a weapon firing standard rifle ammunition that couldn't breach reinforced walls. They had never imagined a weapon capable of punching through 6 inches of coral from half a kilometer away. Their entire defensive doctrine, 3 months of construction, thousands of hours of labor, was built on the wrong assumptions. When the US Marines landed on Peleliu, the defenders waited. They allowed the first waves to hit the beaches before opening fire. Mortars, machine guns, and snipers poured fire into the crowded landing zones. Casualties were heavy, and for a moment, it looked like the Japanese plan was working. Then the Brownings came ashore. Sergeant Raymond Fitzgerald, commanding a 3-man M2 crew from Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, dragged his weapon through waist-deep surf under incoming fire. By the time he reached the sand, the Japanese had locked onto his position. Through his field glasses, Fitzgerald saw the flash of a Type 92 muzzle on the ridgeline. nearly 650 yards away. He ordered armor-piercing ammunition loaded. When he squeezed the trigger, the Browning's deep hammering roar filled the air. The weapon kicked against its tripod but stayed true. Fitzgerald walked his fire into the bunker's firing slit and coral began to disintegrate. Within seconds, the opening widened. After less than 20 seconds and 100 rounds, the bunker collapsed inward. The Japanese gun fell silent. In after-action reports, Marine observers described what they saw in technical terms. Sustained .50 caliber fire had compromised the structural integrity of coral and concrete fortifications within seconds. But for the men who witnessed it, it felt like watching the laws of physics shatter. Everywhere the Manchus fired, Japanese strongpoints evaporated. The sound, that deep, thunderous roar, carried across the entire island. Even soldiers hundreds of yards away could hear it. To the Japanese, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a manifestation of industrial power. By the next day, Marine intelligence units were intercepting Japanese radio transmissions filled with panic. Commanders on the ridge were reporting that the Americans had a hell machine that could destroy fortifications built to withstand artillery. One message, intercepted on September 16th, read simply: "Enemy automatic weapons penetrate coral. Fortifications inadequate. Request permission to withdraw." That message was unprecedented. Japanese doctrine demanded soldiers die in place. Withdrawal was forbidden. Yet on Peleliu, defenders began abandoning their positions, not because they were destroyed, but because they had become death traps. Captain Vincent Rousseau of the 7th Marines later described what it was like. "We learned to listen for the sound of success when the 50s opened up. We waited for either silence or movement. Either way, the position was ours." The psychological effect of the Browning had become as decisive as its physical destruction. The Japanese had built their defenses to withstand explosions, not terror. War is often remembered for courage, strategy, and sacrifice, but sometimes it's decided by mathematics, by logistics, industry, and the sheer ability to keep a weapon firing longer than the enemy can endure it. The M2 Browning was not just a machine gun. It was the visible edge of a colossal industrial system, a supply chain stretching from Detroit to the farthest reaches of the Pacific. By mid-1944, the United States was producing more than 100 million 50 caliber rounds every month. Entire factories existed for that single purpose. Brass, lead, copper, and steel were transformed into the ammunition that fed this relentless beast. For every Marine on Peleliu pulling a trigger, thousands of workers back home were forging the tools of his survival. Each M2 weighed nearly 38 kilograms, and every ammunition belt added another 15. It took 3 men to move one, 2 to operate it, and an army of mechanics, loaders, and logisticians to keep it supplied. Yet despite its weight, Marines never complained about carrying it. The Browning meant the difference between life and death. In the coral ridges of Peleliu, tactics began to evolve around this weapon. Rather than rushing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers, Marines learned to suppress them first with streams of .50 caliber fire. The heavy bullets shattered walls, blew open firing slits, and sent shockwaves through defenders crouching inside. Only after the Browning fell silent did the infantry move in to clear the ruins. On some ridges, M2s were mounted on tanks, giving the Marines a mobile fortress of firepower. Others were set up on makeshift tripods built from salvaged scrap metal to gain better angles on enemy caves. Some units even lashed them to landing craft, using them to rake the shorelines and cave mouths as the tide came in. What had started as anti-aircraft gun was now shaping ground combat itself. It was more than a weapon, it was a force of nature. Japanese prisoners captured later described the same phenomenon in almost identical words. Sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a deep vibration that shook the ground, and there was... Some thought the Americans were dropping aerial bombs, only to realize it was one gun, a single Browning firing without pause. One captured officer told his interrogators, "We thought it was your artillery, but it was only one machine gun." Japan's commanders eventually understood that the Americans had developed a weapon perfectly suited for the Pacific battlefield. A union of power, reliability, and volume that nothing in their arsenal could rival. Their Type 92 heavy machine gun, accurate but underpowered, fired a 7.7 M round with less than a fifth of the .50 caliber's energy. The difference wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. Japan had built its war machine on endurance and discipline, on the human spirit's capacity to suffer and prevail. America had built its war machine on engineering, on machines that could do the suffering for you. The M2 Browning embodied that ideal. A weapon of steel and mathematics, tireless and precise. It could fire until its barrel glowed red, and even then, a new barrel could be swapped in seconds. It could jam, and a Marine could fix it in the mud with nothing but a screwdriver and grit. It could sit in the jungle for days, then awaken with the same deadly rhythm as before, and that reliability turned into dominance. By the fourth day of the battle, the Japanese command on Peleliu was collapsing. Their radio intercepts show frantic attempts to reposition artillery, but every move was met with suppressive fire from Browning crews. The Americans had learned to use the M2 not just as a weapon, but as a method of control. They fired into suspected routes, into openings, into the night. It became less about precision and more about presence, a reminder that there was no safety, not even in the dark. Marines called it the steel rain. For hours, Browning crews would pour belts of ammunition into the ridges, flattening anything that dared to move. The weapon didn't just dominate the landscape, it defined it. As ammunition and morale dwindled, the Japanese began moving only at night, creeping between caves and tunnels to avoid the all-seeing American fire. But the Marines adapted again, setting up overlapping arcs of Browning coverage, guided by flares and spotters. Every flash of movement was met with thunder. Night offered no escape. The Battle of Peleliu became more than a struggle for ground. It became a study in industrial warfare, of what happens when a nation's factories and engineers wage war alongside its soldiers. Historians would later note that for every American infantryman on Peleliu, nearly 7 tons of supplies and ammunition were shipped to the island. The M2 Browning was at the heart of that calculation. By late September, the defenders were starving, their ammunition exhausted. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the garrison, sent his final message to Tokyo on October 12th. "Our weapons are silent. Ailamese guns never cease." That night, he committed ritual suicide. The island fell days later. The cost was staggering. Over 9,000 American casualties. Nearly the entire Japanese garrison annihilated. But in the aftermath, when analysts reviewed the engagement, one conclusion stood out. The weapon that had shaped the battle more than any other was the .50 caliber machine gun. The flamethrowers and mortars were deadly, but it was the sustained, precise and terrifying fire of the M2 that cracked open Peleliu's coral heart. The Japanese post-battle analysis, recovered after the war, put it plainly. Conventional fortifications are ineffective against large-caliber automatic fire. Psychological resistance of troops weakens under sustained bombardment. Enemy heavy machine guns equal small artillery. They had no answer. The US military took the lessons of Peleliu and carried them forward. Every invasion that followed late Iwo Jima, Okinawa saw an even greater concentration of M2 firepower. Tanks, landing craft, trucks and jeeps carried them. Aircraft mounted them in clusters. The Browning had become the beating heart of American firepower across the Pacific, and wherever the Marines went, the devil's roar followed. Sound. The roar of a .50 caliber fades into the calm of ocean waves. The island of Peleliu still bears the scars of that roar today. Bunkers with clean circular holes punched through solid coral. Walls fractured and melted by the impact of armor-piercing rounds. In the stillness of the jungle, rusted tripods and corroded shells rest in the shade of palm trees, silent reminders of the weapon that once ruled the island. For the men who survived, the sound of the M2 was unforgettable. Veterans would later describe it as the heartbeat of the battlefield. Steady, mechanical, and unstoppable. It was more than a gun. It was a message. A declaration that industry, when harnessed to purpose, could turn raw steel into dominance. From Peleliu to Korea, from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, that same gun has endured. The design is unchanged, the rhythm the same, the sound unmistakable. The same weapon that shattered bunkers on a forgotten coral island still echoes across modern battlefields, a living artifact of power and persistence, and somewhere beneath the silence of the Pacific, that old name lingers on the wind. Akuma, no buki, the devil's weapon. After Korea and Vietnam, the Army .50 caliber Browning did not retire into a museum. Rather, it moved into every new form of modern warfare. The gun's presence followed technological shifts. It rode on armoured vehicles and patrol boats, barked from helicopter door mounts, and sat in fixed emplacements on forward operating bases. Its hardware adapted not by reinventing the core mechanism, but by changing how the gun was integrated with other systems. Mechanically, the M2's essential architecture remained the same. A heavy barrel automatic that fired the 50 BMG cartridge from linked belts. But engineers and soldiers focused on adapting the weapon to new tactical demands. Mounts became lighter and more versatile. Pintail and turret fittings allowed rapid switching between anti-personnel and anti-material roles. Helicopter door mounts and chin turrets changed how commanders thought about fire support. Shui with a pair of Machus could lay down suppressive fire while inserting troops, transforming air mobility into immediate concentrated firepower. Ammunition diversified in response to new threats. Armor-piercing rounds, incendiary combinations, and specialized traces gave Browning crews the ability to tailor effects. Penetrate light armor, ignite fuel, or guide adjusting fire at night. These developments didn't change the gun's personality, they enlarged its toolkit. Across multiple conflicts, 50 became at once a blunt instrument of destruction and a precision tool for shaping a battlefield. Equally important was the movement toward vehicle and platform integration. The Browning found a second life as a coaxial weapon and a stabilized remote mount. On armored personnel carriers and naval craft, the gun was paired with optics and fire controls that let gunners hit targets at longer ranges and in worse conditions. This modularity extended the Browning's reach and made it a multi-role asset rather than a single-function relic. Sound. A spoken pattern of small arms fire, then a pause holding the silence before a single Browning crack. Technical detail alone does not explain the Browning's enduring role. The psychological dimension, how the weapon sounded, how it made people feel, became increasingly central to doctrine. Commanders learned that the FON-50's effect was as much about perception as destruction. On the ground, the Browning's long-range reach allowed forces to dominate space before an enemy could close. That domination was experienced as both audible and visceral, the slow, heavy impact of a 50-round hitting earth or fortification produces a different acoustic signature than rifle fire. Lower frequency, fuller resonance, a sound that seems to move through the body rather than merely the ear. Soldiers who endured it described it as a pressure that preceded pain. Civilians nearby reported windows rattling and dogs going silent. That low-frequency rumble communicates permanence. Something heavy and inexorable is coming. Military psychologists and commanders learned to exploit that quality. In the 1970s and 1980s, doctrine increasingly treated heavy automatic weapons not only as direct-fire assets, but as tools of controlled intimidation. On patrol, a Browning placed on a ridge could keep a valley quiet for hours. Its presence discouraged movement, stole initiative, and imposed a psychological deadline on any force trying to operate within its arc. This kind of area denial did not require precise targeting, only presence and the credible threat of sustained devastating fire. Training reflected this blended role. But late engagement, but longer-term suppression, alternating belts to keep barrels cooped, fire. Coordinating with make the Brownings roar the key for follow-on fires, and mastering the rhythms that conveyed intent to friend and foe alike. In essence, the gun became a language. Its cadence and timing said a do not move, a retreat, or a prepare to be destroyed. The psychological effect also altered enemy behavior. In guerrilla and insurgent contexts, fighters adapted by moving at night, dispersing into smaller cells, or avoiding linear communication routes. But those adaptations had costs, slower movement, fractured logistics, and a loss of tempo. The Browning's psychological reach, therefore, had strategic implications. It could force an adversary into tactics that made them less effective over time. Sound. Archival radio voice. Low and clerical background. Metallic clanging of a maintenance shop. From a doctrinal perspective, the late 20th century saw the Browning used as a force multiplier in a wider combined arms mindset. Commanders used it to shape engagements before tanks or infantry closed. They paired it with aerial reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and later, night vision equipment, and laser rangefinders. No longer was the Browning simply a last-ditch anti-vehicle or defensive mount. It was an anticipatory tool used to set conditions for maneuver. At the same time, the Browning's ubiquity spread it beyond US forces. NATO allies, regional partners, and many other armies adopted the 50 BMG and derivatives. It became a common denominator in coalition warfare. When Allied units shared ammunition types and mounts, the learning curve for employing heavy automatic fire shortened dramatically. That interoperability reinforced the weapon's strategic value. Logistics, training, and doctrine were easier to harmonize across partners. Yet the Browning's long use raised questions about ethics and proportionality that grew more prominent by the late 20th century. As conflict increasingly involved urban and mixed civilian military environments, commanders had to weigh the weapon's destructive power against potential collateral harm. Rules of engagement and stricter fire control measures emerged in response. Positive target identification, fire authorization hierarchies, and restrictive firing arcs became common to minimize civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. The Browning's psychological potency had to be harnessed responsibly, and that awareness changed how commanders planned operations. Sound. Wind over a desolate landscape, then the soft click of a Browning being cleared and closed. When we look back across the late 20th century, the M2 Browning story is not one of simple technological triumph, but of adaptation. Mechanical constancy matched with tactical flexibility, and firepower married to psychological strategy. Its evolution was less about redesign and more about integration, adding optics, new mounts, better ammunition, and doctrine that turned a single gun into a distributed system of influence. The weapon's cultural life also matured. Films, documentaries, and veterans' memoirs made the Browning part of the public imagination. It became shorthand in conversation and cinema for unstoppable force, a sound cue that signaled danger, authority, or decisive action. That cultural echo reinforced the tactical one. When an enemy recognized the sound from film or rumor, its effect multiplied. Finally, its continued use into the modern era underscores a simple truth. Some designs get the balance of form and function so right that they outlast fashions in military technology. The M2 did not win wars on its own, but as a tool of both destruction and deterrence, an instrument that could physically break fortifications and mentally erode resistance, it became central to how industrialized militaries thought about controlling terrain. The Browning's power was not only a matter of metal and mechanism, it was the marriage of a reliable machine to a diverse arsenal of ammunition engineered to do very different jobs. Crews carried belts for penetration and belts for spectacle. Heavy armor-piercing rounds designed to punch through thin armor or engine blocks. Incendiary piercing mixers meant to set fuel or wooden structures alight. Tracer rounds to guide aim and signal targets at night. And later, high-velocity saboted projectiles developed to defeat modern light armor at extended ranges. This mix allowed a single gun crew to go from anti-personnel suppression to disabling vehicles to creating show-stopping effects on enemy fortifications. The result was tactical flexibility, one mount, many missions, and a psychological split-second in which defenders had to decide what they were facing, often without enough information to choose wisely. Platform adaptations multiplied the Browning's utility. It rode on everything. Fixed tripods on ridgelines, pintail mounts on trucks and jeeps, armored turrets on personnel carriers, naval pintles on patrol boats, and ring mounts in helicopter doors. Each mounting demanded different drill and discipline. A tripod crew learned to trade mobility for accuracy and sustained fire. A vehicle gunner learned to deliver rapid traversing fire while on the move. A riverine or littoral gunner had to account for pitch and roll. Helicopter door gunners practiced short, precise bursts during fast rope insertions and landing zone suppression. In the late 20th century, those roles were enhanced by optics and stabilization. Night vision gear and infrared sights turned the Browning into a nocturnal dominator. Rangefinders and simple fire control overlays let crews bracket targets and coordinate with artillery. The Browning's bark became the introductory chord to a larger, lethal symphony. And crew doctrine were where the gun's psychological power was intentionally turned into an operational tool. Crews drilled not only for marksmanship and rate of fire, but for tempo and presence. A textbook Browning section didn't simply open up and spray. It modulated sound and effect with purpose. Rapid bursts created sudden shocks. Steady alternating belts produced a continuous low thunder that eroded morale. Intermittent tracer volleys guided infantry advances and told the enemy that the following strike would be meticulous and deadly. Barrel change drills were choreographed to keep a steady acoustic footprint. As one barrel cooled, another took its place. The sound never dropped to silence. Observers and forward controllers were trained to use the Browning as a timed cue. When the 50s spoke, infantry or armor moved. When they fell quiet, the enemy might be baited into exposure. Logistics were the invisible backbone of that psychological weapon. The Browning's menace only mattered where it could be fed. Supply practices evolved. Forward ammunition points closer to the firing line, dedicated resupply teams shuttling belts under fire, and redundant stocks on vehicles and landing craft so that a sudden burst of a steel rainer could be sustained for hours. Commanders who understood this relationship used the weapon to reshape the enemy's day. A few hours of concentrated .50 cal fire could convince a defending force that daylight movement was suicide, forcing them into a collapse of routine that rippled through their supply chain and planning cycles. In short, logistics converted a gun's mechanical stamina into a psychological attrition campaign. Examples of deliberate psychological employment are numerous and instructive. In cold, high-altitude fights, Browning fire-forced attackers into constrained avenues under artillery observation. In jungle and riverine operations, a Browning on a patrol boat could make entire riverbanks silent, villages, guerrillas, and animals alike, simply because the weapon's presence made movement feel life-threatening. Helicopter insertions used the gun as a sonic overture, a short, terrifying percussion that announced an impending assault and suppressed any defenders on the landing zone. In urban and mixed environments, commanders learned to use short, controlled bursts and tracers as warnings and commands, not merely to kill, but to compel behavior, surrender, withdrawal, or hiding, mindful that indiscriminate use could cost civilian lives and political capital. The enemy's adaptations were predictable, and predictable was useful. Night movement, dispersion into smaller cells, increased camouflage, and use of subterranean routes. Each countermeasure slowed the adversary and made their operations less effective. The Browning's very reputation became part of the tactical equation. When its sound carried into a valley or along a road, morale dropped and hesitation rose. That hesitation often manifested as slower response times, missed opportunities, and fractures in leadership. In many ways, the Browning's psychological reach did what a siege could not achieve. It compressed time, forcing human beings to make decisions under the weight of imminent, mechanized punishment. Technological evolution amplified these effects without changing the core gun. Where once the Browning's influence stopped at line of sight, thermal sights and electro-optical sensors extended its psychological sphere into the night. Remote weapon stations allowed crews to fire from under armor or from behind cover, reducing friendly exposure and making the weapon feel omnipresent. On some modern patrol bases, the M2 sits inside a stabilized mount with camera feeds, meaning the operator can talk with rounds, sights, engage, and reassess, all without stepping into harm's way. That remote capability only increases the acoustic and psychological disconnect. Defenders see nothing and yet feel everything. The cultural dimension fed the tactical one. Film, news footage, and veteran stories circulated images of the 50s thunder. That media imprint made the sound recognizable across cultures and decades. An insurgent in one theater might remember an image or tale from another and feel the associated. That cross-pollination magnified the Browning's psychological effect beyond the immediate theater of operations. Rumor and memory became force multipliers. Finally, the moral calculus surrounding the Browning changed operational planning. In environments with civilians present, commanders had to weigh the weapon's deterrent value against the risk of collateral damage. Positive identification protocols, restrictive arcs of fire, and higher-level fire permissions became standard where the political cost of indiscriminate fire was unacceptable. That restraint itself became a psychological tool. The mere knowledge that a force could act brutally but chooses to act precisely altered the adversary's assessment of both capability and intent. In sum, the last decades of the 20th century did not mechanize away the human element of warfare. They retooled it. The M2 Browning remained a machine of exquisite simplicity, but under the hands of trained crews and within mature logistics systems, it became an instrument of influence, a means of shaping adversary behavior as much as of inflicting casualties. Its roar did not simply break bunkers, it reshaped decision cycles, fractured routines, and made survival itself a tactical consideration. That is why, even as new weapons arrived on the battlefield, commanders seldom relinquished the old 50 cal, not because it was the most modern, but because it was one of the most reliably effective ways to turn metal, sound, and supply into strategic leverage.